The winter of 1969 to 1970, just over 50 years ago, involved a remarkable series of events in the history of the United States and the American South. The Apollo 12 mission that included Tetson Allen Bean launched and successfully returned from the second manned mission to the moon. Sam Walton that winter incorporated Walmart stores in Rogers, Arkansas. The My Lai massacre occurred in Vietnam. The first commercial flight of the Boeing 747 flew from Seattle to Chicago. Incidentally, this year it was announced that they were suspending production of the 747. The soap opera All My Children debuted on ABC. Bert and Ernie were born, thanks to the Children's Television Workshop creating the first episode of Sesame Street. The first Earth Day happened in San Francisco. And in a series of separate violent acts, the several members of the Weathermen and the Black Panthers were killed. Born that winter were actor Matthew McConaughey, Coach Dabo Swinney, rapper Jay-Z, Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, and also born that winter, Hunter Biden. Passing away were Joe Kennedy, father of the president, and the notorious bad guy of countless westerns, Roy Barcroft. Apart from these things, the winter of '69 was far less famous than the preceding summer, now permanently ingrained in the minds of living Americans, thanks to the song Summer of '69, recorded by Canadian rock star Bryan Adams. It was also the summer of Woodstock. But it was likely that summer when editor of Modern Age, Eugene Davidson, perhaps thanks to a little suggestion from M.E. Bradford, decided to publish an article by a promising but still upstart history student named Clyde Wilson. The article that appeared in the winter, the '69-'70 edition of Modern Age, and entitled The Jeffersonian Conservative Tradition, stood in sharp contrast to what most contended was real American conservatism. Not only was the article marked by Wilson's crisp, clear writing style, for which he is now famous and always mesmerizes his students, it also stood squarely against how most self-identified conservatives in the 1960s understood their intellectual genealogy. That article no doubt raised many eyebrows among the conservative movement's elite writers and intellectuals, if that is, they paid any attention. Reportedly, Mel Bradford wrote to Wilson congratulating him on making a big splash with his first published academic piece. As Wilson eventually told his own students generations later, it's always good to make a big splash with your first published piece. As controversial as the article might have been in the winter of '69, it now holds a wide appreciation as one of the timeless essays of the American conservative movement. It is still republished and reread across a variety of academic and learned websites. Scholars still cite it. Students still read it. and countless others benefit from its unique perspective, not only on conservatism as a set of political principles, but on the entirety of American history itself. Throughout the article, Wilson emphasized several key points, each of which deserved a book of their own. Clyde, we're still waiting. He maintained, and I'm going to go through 5 of the key points. First, there is no linear historical transition from one conservative political party to another in the American regime. While obvious to anyone who studies American political history, this one small fact eluded most conservatives in the 1960s, who counted on a conservative tradition stretching from the Philadelphia Convention that produced the Constitution, to the Federalist Party, to the Whig Party, to the Republican Party, all the way to Barry Goldwater. But Clyde said no. Of course, this meant the Republicans were not the official conservative party in the United States. Further, Wilson politely and briefly showed throughout the article that the antebellum Democrats, and then after the Civil War, a few small factions remaining within that political party, as well as an odd coalition of 20th century Southerners and Midwesterners of different parties, might be the closest thing Americans ever saw to a genuinely conservative political party. In short, like a golden era of laissez-faire economics and governing institutions, a conservative national political party was nothing but a myth. Second, Wilson argued that conservatives should seek to conserve, quote, the structure of society and government that is the most organic, legitimate, and just for the American nation. There were no timeless political principles that stretched across millennia. Clyde did not argue that the American regime was rooted in the works of Aristotle or in a Socratic method when originally delivered. Nor did he seek to locate the American regime firmly in some abstract understanding of Western civilization. No, the most organic and most legitimate was what America needed. It would not be just any ideal form of society. None of those will work. Nor can it be forged by some comprehensive prescription of legal activism, political negligence, and corrupt corporate strategies. It must be just, and it must be just for Americans, who were and are a free people of incredible cultural, racial, political, religious, and economic diversity. There could never be a one-size-fits-all on any major political issue. And thus federalism, contrary to the way it was taught across American higher education and American public schools, federalism was not merely a separation of powers into 3 branches. Ask any school child or college student in 1969, what is federalism? And that student would likely say, well, I don't know what that student would likely say. But they could say something about federalism in 1969. Today, probably not. But they would likely have said, well, it's a separation of the powers of government into 3 branches. But that was not Clyde Wilson's understanding of what the framers hoped to achieve. Federalism must instead be a separation of sovereignties. which reside in the people themselves and the institutions and relationships they actively create. And as the people are incredibly diverse, justice and necessity means that the sovereignties characterizing American lives must be equally diverse. There were, contrary to movement conservatism, then and now, there were no 10 founding principles that guided the framers as they reshaped American society along conservative lines. What mattered instead, Wilson argued, is that the framers forged governments fit for the people themselves. Third, Wilson offered a much-needed remedy to the way many conservatives revered the American founding. He insisted that the national constitutional framework of the founders was not without its flaws, and that many opposed the workings of the Philadelphia Convention and feared at the time that the Constitution itself would create a government sliding ever so slowly toward tyranny. At the time of its publication, in the winter of 69 and 70, serious academics did not even know who the Anti-Federalists were. Or worse, they saw the Anti-Federalists, those who opposed the Constitution's ratification, as the intellectual forebears of the New Deal and the Great Society. Yet Clyde Wilson was among the first scholars to present the Anti-Federalists as the early Republic's conservatives, and the Federalist framers, by default, as the real innovators. Fourth, and perhaps most important, Wilson understood then and now that there has always existed in America a heated series of culture wars. Not yet a term employed in the winter of '69, that phrase, culture wars, would soon become commonplace in the heated political battles of the 1970s and 1980s. But as with any great historian worth his or her salt, Wilson understood at an early age that the country has always been a collection of regions, communities, and traditions. Always. And since colonial times, those things jockeyed for cultural power, lorded their own culture over the rest, or sternly resisted and resented any such attempts by others to do so. We didn't invent culture wars in the 1980s. We brought it with us. Fifth and last, what was called populism was not the left-wing proto-progressive movement commonly taught by historians in the late 1980s. Now, rereading this essay 50 years later, I am struck by the forethought and prophetic insight Professor Wilson had so long ago. And here is where I think it is best understood, with this notion called populism. Wilson argued that populism is the ablest reflection of the Jeffersonian conservative tradition. Populists carried forward, albeit imperfectly at times, a commitment to organic government, peaceful coexistence, and a resistance to concentrations of wealth and power. It was Wilson who first noted among scholars that most populists were in the South, and most of those were former Confederates or their descendants. Their political goals were no more radical than any others of their day. When compared to the likes of the progressives or even the Republicans, the populists were clearly the most conservative culturally, politically, and in their commitment to inherited principles. But beyond these five things, Reading between the lines of this now famous article, there is much more that we can say to show its timelessness. For one, throughout the pages there are words and phrases that highlight a general affinity among most Americans across our history, despite our differences. As such, Wilson dismissed the pretentiousness of mainstream conservatism, then and now, with its anti-democratic tendencies. The problem with America, Wilson argued, was never the unwashed masses nor the deplorables. He didn't use that term. Okay, that's my term. The propertyless, nor even the disenfranchised were never to be greatly feared as long as their relationships reflected the complexity of being an American. Instead, the real threat came from the self-conscious elites who were quick, and I quote here, these elites who were, quoting, quick to ally themselves with the mob. Wilson also insisted that the real problem was ideological thinking, and especially taking ideology to such an extreme that it became the identity of a national political party. Here might lie Clyde Wilson's most prophetic and cautionary tale. As bad as the older, earlier American party system might have been in the 18th and 19th and early 20th century, at the very least, it reflected genuine, if not competing, interests among American citizens. They reflected something real. They were based on real needs of real people with real concerns, even if they were competing. Some were honest. Some were not so honest. But regardless, these interests often fit together in an unruly puzzle as national statesmen carefully juggled each one to build a ruling coalition. Political parties were coalitions. They were never singular, homogeneous entities. Now, usually, the political party that came out on top was the one that put together what best reflected the majority interest in the country, like it or not. Until, that is, one or more of these interest groups got tired of the rest and shifted their party allegiance. It was not perfect, but it was a political system that kept Americans together in such a way that they respected each other's existence. Such was not the case, Wilson seemed to surmise, when sectional elites grew tired of honoring interest and the complexity of American life. They then chose what to them seemed to be the easiest path forward. Identify a set of ideas, abstract ideas, or craft a full-blown ideology that could unite enough people around one set of beliefs. The natural interest of society then would be sacrificed, and at the same time, all the things that characterize common American life would be cast aside. Abstract ideas would be the only substance of consequence. The only ideas would have consequence. The everyday patterns of normal life would not matter when the union or big business or equality or globalism or whatever abstract idea a political party wished to take on was at stake. For Clyde Wilson, this clearly characterized the Republican Party on the eve of the Civil War. But it also reflects the position of both parties at the height of World War I, or the progressives of the early 20th century, or even the Democratic Party of today. Any political party dedicated to ideological purity as Wilson argued, could never be conservative in any sense of the word. In fact, Clyde closed his article with a nod to Richard Nixon's victory in 1968. The Democratic establishment had sacrificed its traditional moorings for the sake of ideological purity by the end of the 1960s. In doing so, Wilson argued, they cast aside, quote, sensible, productive, and self-respecting lower middle and middle class citizens. They hoped to secure victory by ideologically uniting, quote, discontented minorities and befuddled middle-class voters who responded to pseudo-intellectualizing rather than common sense. And yet, as Clyde noted, they lost to, quote, a new Jeffersonian coalition of productive citizens who were a majority in 44 of the 45 states. 1968. Looking back across the 50 years since the formation of that new Jeffersonian coalition in 68, and the publication of Clyde's The Jeffersonian Conservative Tradition, there are some successes and many failures. What Clyde did not know then, but most certainly knows now, is that the ideological commitment of the Democratic Party in 1968 was no passing fancy, as it had been previously in American history among other political parties. This time, the ideology took hold and took on new shapes as it forced out of the party sensible people whose interests no longer met an ideological litmus test. And thus began the awkward and tragic history of the American deplorable. The common people who served as the backbone of the Jeffersonian conservative tradition, because they lived that tradition, fared poorly over the next several decades. Now, I will admit it is true that we can measure the standard of living of most Americans in countless ways, and we can prove that the lives of even the people I'm talking about here improved thanks to new technology and time-saving inventions. I admit that. But it is equally true that their lives were eventually turned upside down. The great hope of 1968 and the winter of 69 and 70 soon gave way to inflation, gas lines, factory closures, deportation of jobs, crumbling public schools, and a world where the largest percentage of women began working outside their homes due as much to financial necessity as to anyone's choice. Black Americans, especially black Southerners, came out of the civil rights movement cherishing their newly obtained rights and status, only to soon watch their neighborhood businesses close, crime rates rise around government-imposed housing, and even their newly claimed dominance in American entertainment eclipsed in the 1970s by none other than disco. But in other ways, the 1970s was the most conservative decade in the 20th century. The Jeffersonian political coalition of 1968 quickly turned into a national cultural movement of sorts. Now, not everyone listened to disco, and the South, whose political institutions long were controlled by white elites and whose political institutions were forcibly changed, the South found its common culture to be the envy of the country. Television programs, musical forms, drama, culinary masters, even religious figures quickly mimicked or fully adopted Southern ways of life across the entire decade. Southern symbols like the Confederate battle flag, moonshine runners, Southern athletic teams, and perhaps most important of all, simple, homey celebration of the bicentennial of the nation's independence throughout the decade forged a lasting legacy in every American child's mind. It is no wonder that the generation born in the 1970s has proven to be one of the most conservative politically generations in American history. We all owe Clyde's article to this, right? Not coincidentally, those things that sustained the Jeffersonian tradition enough continued for yet another Jeffersonian political coalition to form in 1980 and to elect Ronald Reagan president. Now, we are still too close, I think, to the 1980 election to determine accurately which candidate was most genuinely conservative, Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan. And I'm sure many of you disagree and can debate that. But what we do know is that the Reagan administration and Republican operatives took little time to disband that coalition and systematically root out any who seemed too Jeffersonian, too Southern. The Republicans, it seemed, followed the Democrats in forging a party of ideological purity. For the Republicans of the 1980s, it seemed, interest mattered little. Cultural issues only received lip service. And by the 1990s, the deplorables found themselves in the same financial straits as they had in the early 1970s. But unlike the 1970s, Jeffersonian cultural habits in the 90s faced a rising tide of hatred that has continued unabated over the past 25 years. It became so bad that minions of both national parties now treat ideological rage as normal practice. There is no longer any joy in politics. I guess unless you're Donald Trump. The man always seems to be having a good time.
There you go.
To be clear, over the past 50 years, much of what Clyde Wilson had advocated in his article failed to gain ground. The symbols, the basic symbols of the South, slowly gave way to the culture of Los Angeles and Manhattan. At other times, those symbols literally came tumbling down as Southerners furled their flags and tore down their monuments. Today, they openly condemn as racist or as white supremacists. The innocent men and women of the past whose chief sin was looking upon those symbols or hearing in the names of their towns, their schools, and their streets examples of bravery, courage, and the compassion needed to follow General Pershing into the Battle of St. Mihiel, leap into the water at Omaha Beach, or survive in the mountainous deserts of Afghanistan. Still, 2020 is not going to end the way 1970 started. Clyde Wilson's greatest single accomplishment will not be remembered by the vast quantities of his scholarship, nor will it be his cutting-edge reinterpretations of American history that anticipated by over 20 years prize-winning work of subsequent scholars. What mattered, and what I think still matters in Clyde Wilson's arguments, is that those who hold the Jeffersonian conservative tradition dear must be creative. The tradition must live in order to endure. Here is the real essence of the lost cause of the Confederacy, as much as the lost causes throughout American history. The lost causes, now lost causes, of the principles of 76, of Jacksonian democracy, or even the famed but failed Reagan coalition. Theirs was never an effort to draw together a people by their sorrows and in the stale memories of the past. Their purpose, like that of Clyde's efforts, was to inspire and to create. Permanently encasing Confederate soldiers in marble and quaint stories was no symbolic act of a people who just wanted to preserve a past social relationship, any more than these other groups I've mentioned were trying to restore a quote-unquote true founding. Theirs was never a battle for ideas, nor in any general sense a reawakening of hate and oppression. Rather, the goal of those who built Confederate monuments, voted for Richard Nixon and Donald Trump, bravely took their blue slips when the town factory closed, went to work when their husband's income could not secure a middle-class living, or sang Christians' hymns when they watched the old-time gospel hour. It all involved so much more. Then and now, those people, they want to live. They want to live free from a self-appointed and near comatose elite trampling them into the ground. They want to prove, as Thomas Jefferson once wrote, that humanity was not born with saddles on their backs. Throughout his career, Clyde Wilson consistently challenged his students and those who would listen that responding tit for tat to every criticism was violating what Scripture teaches. The foolishness of some people is so hardened that you cannot beat good sense into them. You must create. We have lost many of our symbols, but is that loss any more than generations of Americans before us? The settlers of Jamestown and most of the first presidents of the United States did not need a battle flag or a song or even a place name to survive and create something wonderful. However, symbols do matter. And let me suggest a new symbol in Clyde's honor that only good Southerners or good American Jeffersonians will really understand. So, shh, this is going to be a secret writing, a secret symbol. In recent decades, this new symbol I propose has become the essential, ubiquitous image of the rural South and is in vivid contrast to the pink houses and white picket fences of Lincoln's America, or the polished steel and sterile condominiums of today's technological elite. This new symbol of the Jeffersonian conservative tradition is the old, rusted truck sitting wheelless on top of cinder blocks in a front yard. Shh. For today's elite, this truck represents everything that is wrong with Southerners of all races and Jeffersonian deplorables of every region. For them, it shows a people who are literally stuck. They are stuck in the past with a dilapidated vehicle, stuck in a rundown home, stuck without enough sense or opportunity to get a good job or to pursue a college degree so we can become like them. Or even people who are unable to consider that there might be something newer, fresher, faster, and better suited for modern life. For our betters, Jeffersonian America, whether we call it flyover country or something else, is a small town where people plant idols to the past in their front yards in the form of a vehicle we are all better off to forget. But for those of us who actually have or once had said vehicle in our yard, or more likely under our carport or in our garage, we know better. For those who have it, they know better. They know the love of a father and his son as they spend countless hours tooling away at the old truck, laughing and learning and talking about the real facts of life. Those with a truck on bricks know of the cool breeze that comes down from the mountains in late summer and promises the first glimpse of fall because they are outside. They know what it's like when the heavy humidity of the afternoon lightens in the air while the sun sets and the crickets begin to sing. They know of a people who no longer own their own country, but love it nonetheless. A people who expect their government officials to actually work to improve their lives, and for business owners to not forsake them just because things are supposedly cheaper overseas. But most of all, those with trucks on blocks know that when something cannot be preserved as it once was, good Christian stewardship demands that parts of it be used to create something new. These are the real creators. These are the men and women of real imagination. They have the endurance to teach their own children, to start their own businesses, to practice in a field where others tell them they have no chance, or to vote for candidates that the establishment literally hates. These people do not waste their time in endless debates and ideological quarrels. They create. They do not know what it's like to fight lost causes because in their mind, they've never really lost. They may not always defend well what they love, nor can they always be counted on to stand up for what is right. But never once did they ever believe that what they created would be perfect. They know how to take what remains of the past, combine it with the best that they have, then create something new. That's the truck in the front yard. For Clyde Wilson, the Jeffersonian conservative tradition was never a stale embrace of the past for its own sake. It conserves only to produce something better. Now, as my co-author, H. Lee Cheek, argues, in terms of intellectual history and political thought, Clyde Wilson's essays initiated a quiet revolution, Wilson reminded us that Thomas Jefferson serves as the Republican patriarch, the political thinker who had incorporated the old Republican understanding of liberty into a theory of federal relationships that were most conducive to the life of a community in any good political order. Regardless of the desire to insinuate the uniformity of Jefferson's political thinking, a common practice among scholars, as Wilson reminds us, we must too remember the vitality of Jefferson as a political thinker and the essential ambiguities of his thought. I should add to Lee's remarks here that all of us who are in the business of education, we know of Clyde as the editor and the singular authority on John Calhoun. But it's as a scholar of Jefferson that Clyde will likely have his greatest legacy. As he has argued consistently throughout his life, any adequate understanding of Jefferson necessitates an appreciation for his Kentucky Resolution. It is in the primary text of American Republican canon. In these documents, Jefferson provides a means for restoring to the regime its simple design of state authority, allowing for, quote, mutual security and more perfect protection of our liberty and tranquility. Amidst the confusion of Judge Amy Barrett's recent nomination and quite likely forthcoming confirmation to our country's highest court, and to her attachment to what she calls a natural rights republic, we must remember Clyde's arguments and realize that this will be a place devoid of Jefferson's self-restraint. And I close with this. I first read Clyde Wilson's article when I was a sophomore in college. Admittedly, I was bored and I was lonely. But the article touched my life in untold ways. It was simple, but I found it incredibly relevant. A few years later, I met Clyde Wilson, Mel Bradford, and ostensibly the father of modern conservatism, Russell Kirk, together at a conference in Baton Rouge, which I understand was the last time the three of them were ever together. I know it was the last time Mel and Kirk were together. You never saw Russell after Baton Rouge, right?
Not at the same time.
Okay. Shortly thereafter, I went to study with Clyde at the University of South Carolina. In fact, I am now just a few years, actually just a matter of months, from being the same age as Clyde was then. I never produced, nor am I likely to ever produce, an article like Clyde Wilson's. I will never write as well, read as much, nor ever share even a smidgen of his insight. But I will continue to be inspired. And I challenge you to also be inspired and to work hard with me and others to always create those things that Clyde Wilson said best represents the Jeffersonian conservative tradition. That we will work together to create. That we will create friendship. That we will create loyalty. That we will exercise stewardship. That we will have joy and laughter. That we will forgive. And that we will cherish and hold a love of place and a love of home. And most of all, that together we will foster an appreciation for an inherited land and the generations of traditions that make that land worth defending and its future worth living. Thank you.